Hey guys, welcome back to seminar. The quizzes should be in here. I guess I learned some lessons on the right settings or wrong settings to use in EagleWeb, so we'll just keep moving forward. Seminar is about reading scientific papers, but the topic for the seminar is biodiversity, and one topic that really kind of at the heart of my intellectual interest. This slide shows a group of salamanders called the polydoglossans that live in Mexico, Central and South America. Just a group that really captured my imagination, and really biodiversity is apparent just looking at this one photo here. There are 6 species of in this genus, Polydoglossa. Mollusks, right? Look at this, is just amazing, the different gastropod species, right? You can see this, you go to the beach, everyone loves to look at shells. That's again biodiversity, and we see the different species richness here, the different shapes, sizes, adaptations to existing. Carnivorous plants, very difficult to make sense of all this diversity. This is what systematist. Dr. Davenport is a plant systematist, and that's what she loves to do is making sense of this diversity of plants. And that's what the first 2 chapters I wanted you to read from E.O. Wilson's book Biodiversity was just defining the standard measure of biodiversity. Right? How do we conceptualize this diversity and make sense of it and put values, frankly, on which part of biodiversity is the most important, which is the least important? Because we're at a point in history where we have to pick and choose. Right here, lovebirds, different species of them. I believe these guys live in Australia. We can tell the interesting thing about birds is just the color variation that allows us to group and categorize them. Okay, so we said really the importance of having a standard unit is just it allows us to make sense of the chaos. It allows us to have a starting point, a reference point, so that when we find new diversity, we can compare it against something. We need to be able to communicate and study biodiversity, and so we need some kind of measure. Just like in physics, there are all these standard measures, and in chemistry, right? Physical sciences like that, it's much easier to have a very standardized unit of measure. Much more difficult in in this study of biodiversity. And I think Wilson does a good job of laying out what is that standard unit of measure and what are some of the challenges. We've really arrived at this as being the standard unit as species. And, I think looking at those last slides, that's kind of a familiar topic or familiar concept to you. Even when we go to the grocery store, right? There's zucchini, there's yellow squash, there's corn, there's cucumbers, there's chickens, there's beef, or cows. There are different types of fish, whether you like catfish or whether you like salmon or tuna. Those are all species. So this is a concept that we use in everyday life. But it turns out that it's much more difficult to define what a species is and to categorize them. At first, to the untrained person, really who doesn't have the luxury of sitting down and really studying this, it seems very obvious. But as you've seen, I think in chapter 4 and 5, it's not really that simple in nature. Okay, but the best attempt, really, in my opinion, is this concept called the biological species concept. That simply says that species are a cohesive gene pool. They are a group of organisms that share a gene pool they can and do interbreed with each other, and therefore they are more genetically related to each other than they are to other such groups. So here's another second species of biological species of birds. And basically what we see is this pool and this pool, under natural normal circumstances, do not mix. Okay, so there's no gene flow between populations. Seems very simple, right? But we'll see, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but there are some real limitations to this, right? So how do you, if it's about sharing genes and it's about gene flow, then how do you deal with organisms that are asexual and don't ever exchange genes, right? Or rarely exchange genes, such as bacteria, right? Where does a bacterial cell get its genes from? Largely it gets it from its parents, which basically just went from one cell to two cells. Make a copy of a chromosome and divide. And in dividing, you're making a exact copy of the parental genome. That's kind of a simplistic view of bacteria because, in fact, mutations happen and those mutations get passed down vertically so we have, the parent that divides into two, right? And then they keep dividing and dividing, and so in that way we have vertical gene exchange. But there also, which is so unique to the prokaryotes, we have what we call horizontal gene flow. So maybe this bacteria dies and its membrane degrades, and then another bacteria can actually absorb and incorporate genetic components of that cell. So we have not from parent to daughter to parent, so on and so forth down through generations, we can transfer genes from one living organism to another horizontally. And that's a big topic of discussion. How do we define species of prokaryotes? And we've seen how just critically important to human health and to environmental health these prokaryotes are. So that's one of the limitations. And then, of course, how do we deal with extinct species? This is a mock-up model of this type of pterosaur. There are ways around this, right? There are other concepts that we can use. We can use the phylogenetic species concept, which says that a species is a group of independently evolving organisms, and that is largely defined by looking at phylogenies or family trees. So basically, if you are on a separate branch of a family tree and you are diverging from the other branches, then you can be considered a different species. Right? Again, assuming there's no horizontal gene flow. And we can also look at the shape of animals, or plants, organisms. I keep saying animals because that's what I'm accustomed to teaching about, but any type of organism, its shape can be useful in defining whether it's a different species. And for example, these extinct dinosaurs, we don't know anything about their genes because the DNA degrades too fast to be fossilized. So we can't build a phylogeny. We don't know about their behavior. We really don't know much about their ecology. All we know is the shape of their bones, their gross anatomy. And so we can use that to make inferences about things like reproductive isolation. Because if you think about it, it's kind of a simple idea that if you share genes with another group, then you should be shaped like that group of organisms, right? Your anatomy, your morphology is determined by your genetics. Okay, so there's going to be a correspondence between these ideas of like the morphological species concept. If you are a biological species and you share a same gene pool, then of course you should not have a wildly different shape than other organisms in that species. Okay, but those are some of the limitations that were brought up by Wilson, and Wilson is he's just communicating what he has read. He's not necessarily an expert in species concepts, but this is just a discussion of the ideas. The other issue with this, and really I guess the biggest issue with defining biological species, is simply that they are not static entities. Species are constantly evolving. Remember, that's really one of the characteristics of living things, is that they do evolve. Populations evolve through time. It's just a byproduct of being alive, right? As long as you're alive, and as long as not everybody's the same, and as long as there's a struggle, then some organisms are going to be better at surviving and reproducing than others, and populations evolve, okay? So when you're looking at a species which is made up of a bunch of populations, right, those populations are evolving and changing, so it's like a moving target, okay? And so here's an example of two different species, right? On the top we have this species. These are found in Europe, the carrion crow, and here is the hooded crow. The hooded crow lives more in Eastern Europe, right? Carrion crows live in Western Europe, Iberian Peninsula, UK, Scotland, right? And then the hooded crow lives more to the east, Soviet Union, former Soviet countries. The two are morphologically distinct, right? The genes for their coat color are maintained as separate. So if you go to Scandinavia, and this is clearly in the range of the hooded crow, then we see that the phenotype is only hooded. So we only see the dark colored birds. If on the other hand we go over into Scotland, where it's basically square, and the carrion crow range, then we see the opposite. Most of the birds that we see are show the carrion crow phenotype. I might have screwed that up. These guys over here look like the hooded crow, right? These guys look mostly like the carrion crow. Down in Italy, all carrion crows. But right there, so what this tells us, that there is something that keeps these two populations separate. There's some reproductive isolating mechanism as defined by biologists as any type of characteristic that prevents interbreeding among species. It prevents hybridization. Okay, and again, Wilson talked about lions and tigers. They don't live in the same habitat. They socially have very different social structures. With the crows, birds are largely visual and or auditory. So if the crow's calls are different, and when a male is trying to attract a female, if his courtship call is not considered attractive to the female, then the female will not mate with him. Okay, so something is present that keeps these two populations separate. Otherwise, they would just mix, and there wouldn't be these two distinct species. However, where the two species meet, okay, shown here in the dashed line, this is called the zone of hybridization. It's not a perfect separation. Those reproductive isolating mechanisms do break down to a degree, and we can see that looking at here. This would be probably Denmark, Germany. My geography is failing me. Yeah, it is Denmark right there. We see a range of phenotypes ranging from the hooded to the carrion, and a mix of everything in between. In the southern part of the range, where the hybridization occurs, we see the same type of thing. So all of what's to say, biological species are maintained. There are carrion and there are hooded crows. There is some type of mechanism that's keeping them apart, but that mechanism is not perfect in the same way, and then therefore really this idea of biological species is not perfect. Okay, but it is the best. It's the best that we can do, right? It was interesting to me. This is something I've thought a lot about lately. That Wilson brought up the idea of race in humans, and if you just look at this objectively, and humans as just another species, species of primate, mammal, and thinking about this concept of race, and from the standpoint of biodiversity, right? And we look here at the top is I would think if you ask people and they could somehow communicate what their conception of race is, would show this, that there are 5 distinctive races, right? That they are enclosed by these hard circles, and that this race is all light blue, these ones dark blue, green, purple, and orange and brown, and that they are very distinctive gene pools, right? And therefore this would be a biological entity. And so if you ask people, does race have a biological underpinning, people I would guess would say yes, right? And that this really is what allowed some very dangerous ideas about certain races have certain genes which make them superior to other races. But in fact, in actuality, when we look at the genetic variation among races, what we see is a couple things. One is that there's a large amount of overlap, right, between the races. Right? So this green is found in both of these races. And actually, I would say this is probably even more simplistic than it is in actuality these days. This was taken from a 2017 article written on Harvard's website. And so we see a lot of overlap. So if you have this individual person, which race are they in? Are they in this race or in this race? Well, it just depends on somebody's subjective opinion. The other thing we notice is, in a lot of cases, within a given race, right, there's more variation within that race than there is between 2 races. Okay, so this tells us basically this is not a good biological concept. Race has no genetic justification. Okay, and in fact, just like in Wilson, he talked about the salamanders and about how do you define subspecies of salamanders? Well, it just depends, and where do those geographic boundaries of a subspecies occur? And he said, well, it depends on what trait you pick, right? If you pick coloration of a certain part of the body, then all of the animals from Virginia and West Virginia might be a subspecies. But if you look at the same group and you pick maybe the length of the tail, then you define subspecies totally differently, right? Because there is no closed gene pools. And those characters vary, what he calls disconcordant. So they're not consistently grouped together spatially, right? And so in that way, it's very similar to human race, right? There really is no specific. Now there are some genes that do tend to, individual genes that tend to vary among races, human races. But if you just take somebody's genetics, it would not be possible for somebody to put them into, like, without seeing the person, putting them into a race. Because we know really race is a social construct. It's really defined by 1 or 2 or 3 genes that determine skin color. But that has nothing to do with overall biological diversity of people. So I think that the reason I bring that up is because it does inform our this idea of diversity and good groupings, and how to classify and make sense of biodiversity. So really what we have arrived at after the reading is that our standard of biodiversity would be the species. Okay, so the standard unit of measure would be the species. Now, so for example, this shows some maybe out west we have, in the far left here, we have this species of bird, the black-throated blue, or probably black-throated green warbler, and we can tell that they are all the same species. However, there is some variation within that species. Okay, so we see slight differences in song, slight differences in behavior, appearances, coloration. So there is genetic diversity within that species. That genetic diversity is part of biodiversity. Okay, we have the species diversity. So here we have the black-throated green warbler, and we have a northern parula, and there may be black burning warblers and black and white and blackpoll warblers. That's another level of diversity, species diversity. Luna moss, red-spotted newts, all the different species of fungi, grizzly bears and black bears. Okay, and then we have on top of, or hierarchically above the species diversity, we have ecosystem diversity. So all these different species then group together into communities, and those communities gather around different abiotic factors. So if you have abiotically a very wet area that doesn't drain and holds water for 10 months of the year, then a certain community of species will gather there and form an ecosystem. So biodiversity also includes tundra ecosystems and temperate forest ecosystems and wetland and stream and lake ecosystems, right? So largely or broadly defined, we can think of biodiversity as the variety of all forms of life, from genes on the left to species up through to the scale of ecosystems. Okay, so but again, we need some reference point, and that reference point is species, because when we talk about genetic diversity, we're talking about diversity of alleles within a given species. When we're talking about ecosystems, we're talking about a group of species that are living in an association together. Okay, so that is the need for this, for the reading that we did, and for understanding what a species is. So where are we going to go from here? We're going to talk about how are species described. We have some idea why species are described. We need to understand how a species comes into existence, not biologically, not the evolutionary forces that create a species, but how do humans now make this human construct called a species. What kind of skills are required, what kind of evidence, and how does such a description look like? Okay, and so that leads us to the reading for next week. I'm going to put this reading up on Canvas. It is kind of a thick paper. I'm going to put up another video that sort of will guide you through the reading and help you to focus in on certain parts of the paper that are maybe more understandable, and the concepts that you should get from that. So look for that here on Canvas. So I plan on being here next week. So we'll see you then. Email me if you have questions. I'm going to put up the reading along with the assignment here momentarily. Thanks.